Welcome back to Bookkast.
Bestsellers in Minutes.
I'm Paul.
I'm Sarah, and we are so excited to be diving into another bestseller with you today.
That's right. We take those impactful best-selling books. You know, the ones everyone's talking about.
Oh yeah, we know them, and we extract those key insights for you, our listener, so you can be in the know.
In just about the time it takes to finish your morning coffee or, maybe like a really good cup of tea.
That's us Bestsellers in Minutes.
Today, Sarah and I are going to be taking a deep dive into a book that has been making waves.
Big waves.
It's Matthew Desmond's Poverty by America.
This one is a powerful read, Paul. It really kind of shakes things up, I think, in how we think about poverty.
It does. And one of the things that makes it so powerful is that Matthew Desmond, a sociologist, he didn't just study poverty from like an academic distance.
No, he didn't. He really immersed himself in it.
Yeah, he lived in low-income communities for years, alongside people facing eviction, experiencing firsthand the housing crisis. And he did this in Milwaukee.
And that's what makes this book so compelling, right? You're not just getting statistics and theories.
Yeah, you're getting real stories.
You're getting real stories. You're getting lived experiences. He actually lived in a mobile home park and then a rooming house to understand these dynamics firsthand.
Yeah, and he built relationships with families. He attended their funerals. He was really in it.
He was in it, and that personal connection really shines through in his analysis.
It does. So our goal today is to unpack Desmond's main argument.
Get to the core of it.
Why does poverty persist so stubbornly in a nation as wealthy as the United States?
A question for the ages, right?
It really is. And to set the stage, Desmond hits us with a pretty jaw-dropping statistic right out the gate.
Oh yeah, he loves to use these statistics to really kind of highlight the stark reality of the situation.
He does, and he talks about the sheer scale of American wealth. And he points out that the U.S. GDP is larger than the combined economies of Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, Canada, and Russia.
Wow, that's quite the list.
It is. It's huge.
So like bigger than all of them combined.
Yeah, bigger than all of them combined. And he puts it in even more concrete terms. He mentions that California's economy by itself is larger than Canada's, and New York's surpasses South Korea's.
So it really kind of begs the question, if we're this wealthy as a nation, why is there so much poverty?
It does, and that's the central question that Desmond tackles head-on in this book.
And I think one of the key things he does is shift the focus of the conversation.
Yeah, how so?
Well, he points out that for like over a century, book studies on poverty, they primarily focus on the poor themselves, like who they are, why they're poor, their circumstances.
Right, sort of deficits in their lives.
Exactly. And he cites all these like landmark works, Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, Jane Addams' work with immigrants in Chicago, the Depression era photography,
Yeah, those iconic images.
Those iconic images by James Agee and Walker Evans, and of course, Michael Harrington's The Other America. These are all incredibly important works, but they share that common focus, right?
On the poor themselves.
On the poor themselves.
So how is Desmond doing it differently?
Well, I think what's so interesting about Desmond's approach is that he kind of flips the script.
He flips the script.
Instead of just documenting the struggles of the poor, he asks us to examine how the actions, the systems of the non-poor contribute to and perpetuate poverty.
Yeah, so it's not just about the poor, it's about the broader system that they're operating in.
Precisely, and I think the most powerful ways he illustrates this is through the story of Crystal.
Crystal, yes, tell us a little bit about her story.
Crystal's story is really heartbreaking, and Desmond uses it to show the very real consequences of these systemic issues. So Crystal, after an assault charge, faced a 2-year ban from low-income housing, and she was at the bottom of a 6-year-long waiting list for housing assistance.
6 years, that's unbelievable.
Unbelievable, and in the meantime, she was forced into the private rental market, where she ended up paying 73% of her income just for rent.
That is just not sustainable, 73%.
It's not sustainable, and this is where Desmond really drives home this point about instability.
Instability.
As a defining feature of poverty.
So it's not just about income, it's about the precariousness of your situation.
Exactly. So because Crystal was struggling to pay that rent, she ended up getting evicted, and then that eviction went on her record, which made it even harder to secure stable housing.
So it's like one thing leads to another and you just get caught in this downward spiral.
Exactly, and it's really tough to break free from that cycle.
Yeah, and her story, it just gets worse from there.
It does. She ends up staying with a friend for a while, but then that falls apart and she's navigating the shelter system. She's relying on the kindness of strangers. She's sleeping on buses and hospital waiting rooms. I mean, it's a really tough situation.
It is. But Desmond emphasizes that even amidst all this, Crystal is incredibly resilient.
She is. She even finds moments to sing gospel music in public, and it's those moments that really kind of highlight her humanity and her spirit.
That's so powerful, and it really speaks to the broader point that poverty is about so much more than just a lack of money.
Absolutely. It's about lack of stability, lack of security, lack of opportunity. And I think that's something that Desmond really captures beautifully in Crystal's story.
He does, and Desmond also highlights the pervasive violence that impacts the lives of many living in poverty.
Yes, this is a really important point. He cites some pretty disturbing statistics about gun violence in Chicago, for instance.
Yeah, and he talks about the high percentage of formerly incarcerated individuals and parents investigated by Child Protective Services who themselves had experienced or witnessed violence as children.
It's a cycle of trauma that really needs to be addressed, and Desmond doesn't shy away from that.
He doesn't, and he uses the stories of his friends Scott and Kimball, or Woo as he calls them, to really illustrate the devastating impact of this trauma.
Yeah, Scott turned to drugs to cope with childhood abuse and tragically died of a relapse.
And Wu neglected a minor injury and ultimately had to have his leg amputated because he didn't have the resources to seek timely medical care.
It's these personal stories that make the human cost of poverty so visceral and so real.
Absolutely. And Desmond argues that eviction is not just some isolated, unfortunate event. It's actually incredibly common in the lives of low-income renters.
Way more common than people realize, I think.
Yeah, he points out that there are over 3.6 million eviction filings every year in the U.S.
That's a huge number.
It is. It's actually comparable to the number of foreclosures during the peak of the 2010 financial crisis.
So we're talking about a massive scale of displacement.
We are, and he really brings to life what that displacement looks like. Those eviction movers coming in, taking everything, even basic necessities.
People are left with nothing. It's hard to even imagine starting over from that point.
It is. And then there's the instability of the job market for low-wage workers.
Yeah.
Desmond talks about this rise of bad jobs.
Bad jobs. Tell me more about that.
Well, these are jobs that are low-paying, few or no benefits, high turnover rates. And we see these in sectors like retail, hospitality, food service,
Yeah. Jobs that are essential but often don't provide a living wage.
Exactly. And Desmond quotes people who talk about feeling expendable, like they could be replaced at any moment, and young people facing this future filled with deep economic uncertainty.
It's a precarious existence, and it leads to what Desmond calls poverty above the poverty line.
Poverty above the poverty line. So what does that mean?
Well, it means that you might technically have an income that's above the official poverty threshold, but you're still experiencing significant economic insecurity.
So you're not officially poor, but you're still really struggling.
Exactly. You're living paycheck to paycheck. You're one unexpected expense away from disaster,
You're constantly worried about making ends meet.
Exactly. And this is a reality for so many Americans, even those who aren't officially classified as poor.
It's a huge issue. And then Desmond throws out another one of those really startling statistics, this one from Nobel laureate Angus Deaton.
Oh yeah, Deaton's work on poverty is incredibly important.
It is. And he found that millions of Americans are living on $4 a day or less.
$4 a day. Wow.
Yeah, it's a level of destitution that's comparable to the poorest populations in countries like India and Bangladesh.
And this is in the United States, the richest country in the world.
It's a really stark reality check.
It is, and it really challenges our assumptions about what poverty looks like in America.
Now, here's where Desmond's analysis gets really interesting. He points out that despite a significant increase in federal spending on means-tested programs, those programs where eligibility depends on your income and assets.
Right, like SNAP benefits, TNF.
Exactly. Between 1980 and 2018, poverty has persisted, so we're spending more, but it doesn't seem to be having the intended impact.
This is where he introduces that idea of the leaky bucket welfare state.
Leaky bucket. So what does he mean by that?
Well, he's saying that while the intention behind these programs might be good, taxpayer dollars being allocated to help those in need, the reality is that not all of that money actually reaches the intended recipients.
So there are inefficiencies in the system. There are barriers that prevent the money from having its full impact.
Exactly. And he talks about how some social policies can actually inadvertently create further hardship for families.
Oh, like what?
Well, for example, he mentions how SSI checks can be reduced if recipients live with relatives.
So if you're trying to, pool resources with family members, you might actually end up losing benefits.
Exactly. And the earned income tax credit can sometimes provide a larger benefit if unmarried parents apply separately.
So the system kind of incentivizes certain behaviors that might not be in the best interest of families.
Exactly. And then he talks about mass incarceration, which he calls a profoundly anti-family, state-sponsored initiative.
And it has a disproportionate impact on Black and Hispanic families.
Absolutely, tearing apart families and communities and really hindering economic mobility.
Now, here's one of Desmond's most challenging arguments, and it's that many people and institutions directly benefit from the existence of poverty.
It's an uncomfortable truth, but I think he's right.
Yeah, he talks about how this can make conversations about poverty really difficult because it forces us to confront some potentially inconvenient truths about our economic system.
Right. It challenges the narrative that we like to tell ourselves about, meritocracy and equal opportunity.
Exactly. And he really gets into the concept of exploitation as a core driver of poverty.
So he's talking about things like low wages, high rents, predatory lending practices.
Right, and he argues that these practices disproportionately affect the poor, but those who are not poor often benefit even indirectly from these systems.
Like, think about how we as consumers benefit from low prices, which are often a result of suppressed wages for workers.
Right, it's a complex system with a lot of interconnected parts.
And he connects this to the long-standing debate about the minimum wage.
The minimum wage, yeah, there's always a lot of back and forth about that.
There is, but Desmond highlights that current research actually suggests that modest increases in the minimum wage don't really have a significant negative impact on employment.
So the argument that raising the minimum wage will lead to job losses is not really supported by the evidence.
Right, and he uses the example of McDonald's, comparing wages and worker conditions in the U.S. versus countries like Denmark, where they have a much higher minimum wage.
Interesting comparison.
It is, and then he looks back at the mid-20th century, a period of greater economic equality in the U.S.
Greater equality.
Greater equality, and he attributes part of that to the power of labor unions like the United Automobile Workers, the AFL-CIO.
So unions played a significant role in creating a more equitable society.
They did, and he argues that the decline in union power, while often framed as, increasing efficiency, has actually contributed to the rise in inequality that we see today.
So the promised benefits of a less unionized workforce haven't really materialized for many people.
And then he talks about the concept of the fissured workplace.
Fissured workplace, so what's that all about?
It's basically the shift towards companies relying more and more on independent contractors and temporary workers rather than traditional employees.
So instead of having people on their payroll, they're using these alternative work arrangements.
Exactly, and this often leads to lower wages, fewer benefits, less job security.
And it disproportionately impacts those who are already most vulnerable to poverty.
And then he details some of the tactics that employers use to limit worker power.
Like what?
Things like discouraging discussions about wages, implementing non-compete agreements, and no poaching agreements, which restrict workers' ability to, move to better opportunities.
So they're kind of trapped in these low-wage jobs.
And then we see how government programs like Medicaid and food stamps can actually end up subsidizing these low-wage employers.
How so?
Well, because if workers aren't being paid a living wage, they have to rely on these public benefits to survive.
So taxpayers are essentially helping to support companies that aren't paying their workers enough.
Exactly. And Desmond points out that even the earned income tax credit, while it does provide some relief to low-income workers, it can also be seen as a way for corporations to avoid paying a living wage.
It's like we're all complicit in this system in some way.
And Desmond challenges us to think about that complicity, especially as consumers. We might care about where our food comes from or what materials are in our clothes. But do we think about the labor practices of the companies we support?
Right. Are we paying attention to the working conditions, the wages of the people who are making those products?
And he mentions the widening black-white pay gap as a stark example of the consequences of these systemic issues.
Yeah, and he even talks about his own family's decision to stop shopping at a particular retailer for ethical reasons.
But he acknowledges that they haven't fully scrutinized all of their choices as consumers.
So it's an ongoing process, right? Becoming more aware of the impact of our spending decisions.
Absolutely. And then shifting gears a bit to housing. Desmond talks about the issue of rising rents, even in cities with high vacancy rates.
Yeah, that seems counterintuitive.
It does, but he explains that it's not just about operating costs for landlords, it's also about the limited housing options available to poor families.
So landlords can charge higher rents because people don't really have any other choice.
Exactly. And he does offer a more nuanced view of landlords, acknowledging that some are exploitative, the stereotypical slumlord, but others are genuinely trying to provide decent housing.
But even with good intentions, the financial pressures of owning rental properties can lead to practices that squeeze tenants.
And then there's the whole predatory world of fringe banking, the check cashing services, the payday loans.
Oh yeah, those can be really dangerous.
It can be incredibly predatory, and Desmond points out that individuals who are already struggling financially end up spending billions of dollars annually on these services.
On fees and interest rates that are just astronomical.
Hundreds of % APR is sometimes it's just unbelievable.
And he talks about how these payday lenders rely on keeping borrowers trapped in a cycle of debt.
The average borrower, he says, remains indebted for 5 months and ends up paying significantly more in fees than the original loan amount.
So it's a system that's designed to exploit people's desperation.
Exactly, and he points out that there's this lack of competition in the industry, and traditional banks aren't really interested in offering more affordable, small-dollar lending options.
So people are left with these really bad choices.
And Desmond argues that the poor often make what seem like bad financial decisions, not because they lack financial literacy, but because they lack better options.
So it's not about a lack of knowledge, it's about a lack of choice.
Exactly, and even policies aimed at boosting income, like increasing the minimum wage, can be offset by landlords raising rents.
So the benefits don't always reach those who need them most.
Right, and he talks about the myth of welfare dependency, this idea that people are choosing to stay on welfare rather than work.
Right, we saw a lot of that rhetoric during the pandemic.
We did, and Desmond points out that the data just doesn't support that narrative. States that cut unemployment benefits didn't see a significant increase in employment.
So it wasn't that people were choosing to stay home because of generous benefits.
Right, and he brings up a really interesting point about welfare avoidance.
Welfare avoidance, so people who are eligible for benefits but aren't accessing them.
Exactly, and there are a lot of reasons for this, stigma, bureaucracy, just the complexity of the system.
It can be really daunting to navigate all of that.
And he points out that even when some of those barriers are reduced, like with the shift to EBT cards for food stamps, we don't always see a significant increase in participation.
So there are other factors at play beyond just stigma.
And Desmond makes this kind of surprising claim that the American poor are terrible at being welfare dependent.
Which goes against the common stereotype.
It does. He says that unlike corporations that are really good at leveraging government benefits and subsidies, the poor often don't fully utilize the available safety net.
It's a really interesting perspective, and he challenges this idea of makers versus takers.
This idea that there are those who contribute to society and those who take from it.
Right, and he cites research showing that the vast majority of Americans across income levels have relied on a major government program at some point in their lives.
So we've all benefited from the safety net in some way.
We have, and here's a really eye-opening statistic. Desmond found that the wealthiest American families receive significantly more in government subsidies than the poorest.
Now, that's something you don't hear very often.
It's not a popular talking point, but it's a reality that he really brings to light.
And it's often obscured by focusing solely on federal income tax, without considering the broader landscape of government benefits and tax expenditures.
So we need to look at the whole picture.
We do, and this leads to what I think is a really uncomfortable but important question that Desmond raises.
What's that?
He asks, is a certain level of poverty simply accepted in America because those who are not poor benefit from it?
So poverty is maintained because it serves the interests of those in power.
And because of that, they're resistant to any real fundamental change.
He describes the period leading up to the financial crisis as a second Gilded Age, characterized by this extreme wealth accumulation at the top.
But beneath that, there was still widespread economic anxiety, even among the middle and upper classes.
And Desmond argues that one of the drivers of this wealth accumulation was tax cuts,
which benefited the wealthy, but often led to underfunding of essential public services.
Yeah, he uses California's Proposition 13 as an example,
which limited property tax increases and has had a really significant impact on the state's budget.
And he talks about how these shifts in tax policy and the decline in the quality of public goods contributed to a fracturing of traditional working-class political coalitions.
With racial identity becoming a more salient factor in voting patterns for some segments of the population.
And then there's this concept of the hoarding of opportunity.
Hoarding of opportunity. So what's he getting at there?
Well, he's talking about how affluent communities are able to use their resources to access better schools, safer neighborhoods, all these things that contribute to a good quality of life.
And that creates a growing divide between the haves and the have-nots.
It does. And he talks about the NMDY attitude, the not in my backyard attitude towards affordable housing.
So even people who might support the idea of affordable housing in theory don't want it built in their own neighborhoods.
Right, they don't want it to impact their property values or, change the character of their community.
And this perpetuates segregation and limits opportunities for low-income families.
So Desmond really comes full circle back to his main argument that poverty in America exists not in spite of our wealth, but because of it.
It's a system that's designed to benefit those at the top, and those at the bottom are often exploited.
And he argues that we as a nation prioritize policies that subsidize the wealthy over policies that alleviate poverty.
It's a system that's rigged in favor of the already privileged.
And he says that this creation of affluent segregated communities fueled by these policies leads to concentrated poverty and despair.
And it doesn't require, active malice to participate in this system. It's more about passive acceptance, just going along with the status quo.
So what are some of the solutions that Desmond proposes?
Well, he starts by talking about improving take-up rates for existing social programs, making sure that people who are eligible for benefits are actually accessing them.
Because as we discussed, there's a lot of welfare avoidance happening.
There is. And he acknowledges that the reasons for this are complex. It's not just about stigma.
Right, there are bureaucratic barriers, there's a lack of awareness sometimes.
And he also addresses concerns about the cost of ending poverty.
Cost, which is always a big concern in these discussions.
It is, but he argues that we need to consider the vast resources that we do have and the amount that we already spend on subsidies for the wealthy.
So it's about priorities, right?
Exactly. And he talks about innovative policy approaches like targeted universalism.
Targeted universalism. I like that term.
Me too. It basically means that while a policy might have a universal goal, like ensuring that everyone has access to healthcare or education, different groups might need different levels and types of support to actually achieve that goal.
So it's about recognizing that equality doesn't always mean treating everyone the same.
Exactly. And he also talks about his dislike for the term redistribution.
Redistribution. Yeah, it's a loaded term.
It is. And he feels like it frames social progress as a taking from one group to give to another.
Rather than a rebalancing of a system that's currently skewed in favor of the wealthy.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important distinction.
So what are some of the specific policy solutions that he advocates for?
Well, he talks a lot about empowering the poor by increasing their choices and their bargaining power.
So giving them more agency.
Exactly. And that includes things like raising the minimum wage to a living wage, eliminating subminimum wages for certain workers, and ensuring that the minimum wage is regularly reviewed and increased to keep pace with the cost of living.
So making sure that people who are working full-time can actually afford to live.
And he talks about the importance of strengthening labor laws and protecting workers' rights to organize.
So making it easier for workers to form unions and bargain collectively.
And he specifically mentions the Clean Slate for Worker Power report, which proposes some really interesting policies to empower workers.
And what about housing?
He's a big advocate for investing in high-quality public housing.
Public housing, yeah, there's been a lot of divestment in that area over the years.
There has, and he points to successful examples like Villa Verde in the South Bronx and Bent Tree Apartments in Austin to show what's possible.
So creating affordable housing that's also sustainable and integrated into the community.
And he talks about expanding homeownership opportunities, particularly for communities that have been historically excluded due to discriminatory practices.
Like redlining and other forms of housing discrimination.
Exactly. And he highlights the USDA's 502 direct loan program as a model for providing access to affordable mortgages.
So making it easier for people to buy homes and build wealth.
And he talks about reining in the predatory practices of the fringe banking industry.
Those payday lenders, check cashing services.
Exactly. He advocates for stricter regulations, mandatory disclosure of loan costs, and he even suggests that the government could get involved through the Postal Service or the Federal Reserve to offer safer and more affordable alternatives.
So creating a more just financial system for everyone.
And he also connects women's economic empowerment to reproductive freedom.
Interesting connection.
He highlights the success of programs like Delaware's Contraceptive Access Now initiative in reducing unintended pregnancies.
And that allows women to pursue education and careers more freely.
Exactly. And ultimately, Desmond argues that Those in positions of power, political leaders, corporate executives, lobbyists, wealthy property owners, they have a responsibility to work towards dismantling the systems that perpetuate poverty.
So it's not just about individual choices, it's about systemic change.
And he encourages us as individuals to vote with our wallets, support companies with fair labor practices, avoid those that are exploitative.
So being conscious consumers.
And he argues that even ambitious anti-poverty initiatives often fail to address the issue of segregation.
Segregation, the elephant in the room.
He emphasizes the importance of creating truly integrated communities and schools so that everyone has access to the same opportunities.
And that requires dismantling those exclusionary zoning laws.
Exactly, and implementing inclusionary zoning mandate,
which require developers to include a certain percentage of affordable units in new housing projects.
He points to New Jersey's success in this area as a model for other states.
And finally, Desmond tackles this pervasive scarcity mindset.
The idea that there's not enough to go around.
Right, that we have to compete for limited resources.
And he argues that this is a manufactured concept that's used to justify inaction on poverty and pit different groups against each other.
So it's a way of maintaining the status quo.
Exactly, and he calls for a rejection of this false premise.
And he ends with a really powerful question. What is the true cost of poverty?
It's a question that really makes you think.
It does. He talks about all the potential artists, poets, leaders, innovators that we're losing because they're never given the opportunity to thrive.
It's a loss for all of us.
It really is. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for this incredible deep dive into Matthew Desmond's Poverty by America.
It's a book that stays with you.
It does. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this exploration.
Desmond's work really challenges us to reconsider our understanding of poverty and recognize the ways in which we might be contributing to the problem.
He does. And we encourage you to reflect on these concepts of exploitation, the subsidization of affluence, the impact of segregation in your own lives and communities.
Remember, addressing poverty is both a personal and a political project. Think about your consumer choices, your investments, how you engage with your community.
And if you're interested in learning more, we highly recommend picking up a copy of Poverty by America.
It's an essential read for anyone who wants to understand this critical issue.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive into a best-selling book. This has been Bookkast.
Bestsellers in minutes.
Until next time.
See you then.